Well, moving on to the structural challenges that the government faces, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Craig Prescott, an expert in United Kingdom constitutional law and politics, with a particular focus on Parliament devolution and Brexit. So who better to dive into than all of the constitutional issues that we are exploring? Let's start with this Rwanda policy. What chances does the government have of actually getting it through?
Good morning. I think what's interesting to remember is that the decision of the European Court was an interim decision, that because the plane was literally on the runway, the court was asked to grant what's called an interim injunction, which is, does the claimant, did the people on the plane, or would have been on the plane, have a reasonable argument in law? Not necessarily that they would win, but do they have a viable argument to advance at a more substantive hearing? And the European Court said that they have at least an argument, is not to say that they would win. So the government's policy does live to fight another day before the European courts. And as we've seen, sort of with the High Court and Court of Appeal and Supreme Court, they allowed the measure to go through. So I think legally that the government may be confident that at least as the UK courts are concerned, the Rwanda policy satisfies the courts.
Really, really interesting stuff there. Let's move on to something else that is, I suppose, taking up time in the courts this week. Of course, the Scottish Government's attempt to try and assert that it has the right to push forward a rerun of the 2014 independence British partition referendum. Of course, we've been the Supreme Court's been hearing arguments about this over the last couple of days. Where are we with it?
OK, so Nicola Sturgeon has announced a draft bill that makes provision for a second Scottish independence referendum. The legal issue is that matters relating to the Constitution, which includes the future of the Union, are reserved to the Westminster Parliament. Now, to hold the first independence referendum, essentially the governments of Scotland and Wales and the parliaments of Scotland and Wales struck up an agreement by which the Scottish Parliament could pass the necessary legislation, and so it was legally watertight. Essentially, what Nicola Sturgeon has proposed is what's called a totally advisory referendum. So essentially, it is just, let's hold a referendum asking this question of the Scottish people. And there's an interesting question there, because if it's not legally binding, does it have any legal effect to touch a matter that's reserved to the Westminster Parliament? And so that's really the matter that is being argued before the Supreme Court. It seems to me that if it looks like a referendum, talks like a referendum, walks like a referendum, it may well be a referendum. So that it's interesting territory. Of course, this is all untested. This will be a new precedent. The other point to make is that this is only a draft bill. And, governments produce draft bills all the time. And so we're on a hypothetical question here, because this isn't the law. The Scottish Parliament hasn't made this draft bill yet into an act of the Scottish Parliament. And usually when legislation is challenged, it's because it's been made by the Scottish Parliament. So the Supreme Court may reject the entire thing, saying this is a hypothetical question because we don't have any law here yet. Come back to us when the Scottish Parliament has passed this draft bill as legislation.